Welcome to episode 116 of the Headspace and Timing podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Shauna Springer, the Senior Director for the Tragedy Assistant Program for Survivors, Suicide Prevention and Postvention Program.
I had a conversation just last week with a Marine who talked about meeting up with a former battle buddy and actually somebody who outranked him. And that person brought up the topic of fear when you're in a combat zone. You know, that sometimes we don't even admit to feeling intense fear when you're about to go into combat and things are about to go kinetic. And so just talking about the fear that they experienced helped both of them just dissolve that fear, the shame around the fear that's generated when those things stay hidden. So there is a real and just profound power in flushing these things out with people that are safe to hear them and that don't think any differently of you, that you can just reckon with them and confront them head on to really move through them.
Before we kick off the interview, I'd like to bring you a quick message from Dr. Barbara Van Dalen, founder and president of Give an Hour, about an event that's coming up June 9th through the 15th.
I'm Dr. Barbara Van Dalen, founder and president of Give an Hour and the Campaign to Change Direction. We want everyone to join us the second week of June for a week to change direction and the Change Direction Jam. Together, we're changing the culture of mental health. Events during the week can happen anywhere and everywhere. We're so excited to work with IBM to create this global discussion. Mark your calendar, register, and join us to change direction. Go to changedirection.org. That's changedirection.org to learn more.
Here at Headspace and Timing, we'll be joining Give an Hour during that week. The podcast episode that week will be with Dr. Van Dalen, and that week's blog post is going to focus on the campaign to change direction. Longtime listeners will know that our mission is to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health, and the campaign to change direction is doing exactly that. Make sure to check them out at changedirection.org. Welcome to the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Dwayne France, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. Once again, and as always, we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and learn more about veteran mental health. Today's guest is one that I've been having a couple conversations with over the last several months. A while back, I put out a call to some of my connections on who I should have on the podcast to talk about veteran mental health. And a number of our mutual connections said that I should really reach out and talk to Doc Springer. And so my guest today is Shauna Springer. She's the TAPS Suicide Prevention and Postvention Senior Director. She works for the Tragedy Assistant Program for Survivors, which is a great organization. Again, I've been wanting to highlight them on the show for a while. So, Shauna, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dwayne. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed our previous conversations and looking forward to this one. So definitely, as I'd mentioned, I've been wanting to get involved and talk about what TAPS is doing for the Gold Star families and survivors. But before we get into that, I want to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and sort of how you came to work with veterans and their families.
Sure. So I've been working with veterans in the community for well over a decade. Spent 8 years of that time doing really in the trenches, frontline work with veterans. And now in my current role as the senior director at TAPS for suicide prevention initiatives, I still get to do quite a bit of work directly with veterans in terms of retreats and special functions that we do from time to time, but mainly in terms of going out and doing trainings and doing consultation, and things like that, including briefings with active duty military. And actually last year I was at the Air Force Academy there in beautiful Colorado Springs to do a big suicide prevention briefing for a couple classes of cadets there, on behalf of TAPS.
Yeah, it definitely, a lot of people come to Colorado Springs to visit, and it seems just as special to us who live here. Yeah, but that's great. So you've been working with veterans for about 10 years. I'm always interested to hear how you got into that, what it was like for you to first start working with veterans.
So my first experience working with veterans was at the Gainesville VA. During my internship, I did a rotation at the Gainesville VA, and it wasn't the whole year, it was just a third of the year. And there was something different about that work, about the groups that I worked with. It just felt like a really good fit. And I've been trying to figure it out ever since. And I think, the best I can kind of determine is that it's kind of a sweet spot for me because I am somebody who really cares about service. My values, even though I never served in the military, align really well with military values because of certain unique aspects of how I was raised, and some of the international service projects and traveling that I did even as a very young person. And then I think that the kind of female I am, it just is a good fit with the population, because I don't elicit from veterans the need to protect me. I think they feel like they can share anything that they need to with me and I'll be fine. But I'm also, maybe not somebody they see quite as, in the hierarchy as somebody that, they need to sort of feel there's a rank issue with. I think I'm able to kind of come alongside, if that makes sense, in a really special way that really feels like a good fit. So it's been over 10 years, but, that's how it kind of developed, over time. Does that make sense?
It does. And how you describe that you're not someone who a veteran feels as though they have to protect. And this is actually something that I've heard from a number of the veterans that I've worked with, is that they're as much concerned about laying their burden on other people. Their family, of course, I don't want my family to feel like this, but also when it sometimes comes to clinicians, they want to protect the clinician because that's what we do, right? We preserve and protect and we care for the people around us. And so that kind of attitude for some veterans can kind of get in the way of doing some real work in therapy.
Right. No, absolutely. I think if they feel like they have to hold back from sharing whatever it is that needs to be discussed, it's definitely going to limit their ability to grow through whatever kinds of pain and hidden, sort of possible traumas that they've experienced. That all has to be flushed out and reckoned with. And so I think it's important as well for clinicians to do their part in communicating, you don't need to protect me. I am radically safe to hear whatever you need to share, and I won't judge you. And we can do the work that we need to do here. That's what we're here to do. So that, it's sort of on both sides, I think, things could change a little bit.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I definitely believe that if a clinician, and we do have some clinicians that listen to this show, but if a clinician is considering working with veterans or has found themselves working with veterans in the community, that there has to be a level of preparation. The provider needs to prepare to be honest with themselves, to say that, can I listen to this? Can I deal with what I'm going to start hearing? My clinical director is an excellent clinician, but she's been a sex offender provider for years, 15 years. And I take my hat off to her. I'm like, better you than me, right? Because not everybody can work with, certain populations. So a clinician who wants to or is considering working with veterans, and perhaps you'd seen this in some of your consultation, you really have to take a look at yourself and say, am I the right person to be sitting across from a veteran?
Yep. And there's work you need to do, as you said, to get ready for that work with veterans. And that includes really taking it upon yourself to understand military culture and veteran culture, not just from a book reading perspective, although I love to read and you can learn a lot from books, but from actually getting out there and working alongside veterans. And I think that's really changed, how I practice, was going out and serving with veterans in organizations, great organizations like Team Rubicon, really shifted my ability to relate to and understand what it feels like to be on a kind of deployment. It's not a combat deployment, but a disaster response deployment, and really work as a team on one mission. You cannot get that from books. So you have to be the kind of person who's willing to be a little bit unconventional and take some risks, and maybe have very good boundaries, but also be really putting the people that you're trying to work with ahead of maybe your comfort level at times, until it becomes comfortable for you to really serve veterans in the way that they deserve to be served.
I can definitely recognize that. I mean, of course, there simply aren't enough of like me, veterans, much less combat veterans in the clinical mental health field. And so if a veteran says, I can only speak to, or I can only work with a therapist who's a veteran, there's just not enough of us. And it's not necessarily true, which is, something that you've shown and that you've proven, and veterans are a very maybe insular team, tribe, let's say. How was it for you being accepted into that group, into the veteran tribe?
Yeah, I'm still kind of amazed by it, to the extent to which there isn't any tension there, and there's an openness, and there's a mutual acceptance and a mutual respect and trust that I have when I work with the veterans that I serve. I think that's where a lot of my childhood experiences and background kind of came in, because, as I said, I never served in the military. I wouldn't want to represent that I did, but I did a lot of travel to a lot of places that were sort of well outside of what we typically see growing up most of the time in the United States. And so really working with and living with and being embedded with people from different cultures and getting comfortable with that, I think helped me to really relate to veterans, and it gave me a real leg up, maybe on those who had really been in school perhaps, but hadn't had some of the foreign travel experience that I was fortunate to have before becoming a psychologist. So I'm a big proponent of really getting outside the classroom, study hard, but that's not the only way to learn, and that's not the only way to learn how to connect with people. And it's a partial education. So really getting out into the world and relating to people is really very important for this work.
No, and you're right. And even, getting out into the world, right? Veterans have a more global viewpoint than maybe somebody in their community who, I've got cousins that rarely leave Missouri, much less St. Louis, right? That just not having that, that access to that understanding of how other people live in the world. And I can see how, when you've been overseas and perhaps if you've been on mission trips or service trips or relief organizations and things like that, that you truly see how challenging things are, and you're not worried when you come back and your coffee is not quite as hot, right? And so those Westworld problems don't mean quite so much. And that's what a lot of veterans experience when they come back is, we understand what real life, real world life is about. And then, somebody comes back and they're complaining because, of traffic or takes them 10 minutes longer to get somewhere. There's a real disconnect for a lot of veterans. And I can see how that global viewpoint from your standpoint, from your travels, has really helped.
Yeah, it really does recalibrate what you see as important. It also teaches you about different cultures and how to be flexible, how to live with frustration when you're not in a place that's comfortable. And beyond that, I think one of the reasons why our warfighters are such an asset to society is that they have done these missions that have given them a sense of what it feels like to trust somebody so completely and to love somebody that you would lay down your life for them. And those kinds of things I think are really unique, and they make our warfighters and our veterans, anyone who's served, irreplaceable assets to society. So my suicide prevention work is grounded in that understanding. And some of the other pieces about living in other cultures and experiencing different things that recalibrate my sense of what's important, I think those things are things that veterans and service members maybe instinctively realize that we see in a similar way. So that's why it's been easier, I think, to build the trust in some cases.
Right, and those things don't necessarily have to go along with combat. Care and concern and putting your life in someone else's hands and having their life in yours. I mean, yes, that is an actual a combat experience, but also if you're just enduring any type of hardship, there is a lot of affinity for law enforcement, first responders, things like that. Some of those because they have a veteran community, there's a large number of veterans that transition into those jobs, but also just sort of a recognized respect of, you put your life on the line, you've chosen a profession that you choose to serve others and things like that. And so, again, finding out what's more common with veterans. And so you can say, look, I understand this aspect of it. I don't know what the sound of a dish go round hitting the windshield sounds like, but all the other pieces, I really understand it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said that, Dwayne, because I think there's a lot of overlap between our first responders and those who serve in the armed forces. It's just that real orientation to service and a sense of kind of having a moral core, a warrior code, if you will, that is true for a lot of our first responders as well. And it's definitely not that there's total overlap, as you said, but there's enough overlap that you can bridge the trust and then kind of go from there.
Right, and this may even be, looking at it from your suicide prevention and postvention intervention lens. There's a national conversation around veteran mental health, of course, right? This podcast and many people, the VA is looking at it and private organizations all over the place, but there's not really a national conversation around first responder mental health. And arguably, and from this definitely isn't my area of expertise, but I understand that the suicide rates in the first responder community are just as egregious as they are in the veteran community.
Well, yeah, the suicide rate across the country as a whole is something that we all need to kind of really look at. Most people, I find, don't know that we lose more to suicide than to car accidents or homicide, let alone, hostile acts of war. So it's a really interesting thing because it's an intensely private battle. And at the same time, it's something that has started to become quite visible in the media and in the press. And we do a lot of work at TAPS with how to safely talk about suicide so that we can decrease the risk for those who are impacted by suicide loss. Veterans, military service members, first responders, they are impacted by many times over the loss of others that they love. Not at the end of their lifespan in a sort of natural way, but in these sudden, unpredictable, violent deaths. So they have a grief burden that is disproportionate relative to the population at large. But suicide is a society-wide problem that doesn't just apply to veterans and first responders.
No, you're absolutely true. A colleague of mine, Tony Williams, he often says it's a national problem, but requires a local solution, right? Every community is different and you need to have different resources in different communities, but really that community response, not just local response, but like say the veteran community, the first responder community, or the survivor community is what TAPS has really helped develop, is a community of individuals that have this shared experience. I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about what TAPS is and what they do.
I'd love to. So TAPS, Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, is a national nonprofit based in the Washington, D.C. area. And we provide compassionate care to all those who are grieving the loss of a military loved one, whether active duty or veteran. And the survivors are anyone who is impacted by loss, and we don't turn anyone away based on the type of loss. So we have loss due to hostile acts of war, we have accidents, we have illnesses, and we have suicide loss. And it used to be that the hostile acts of war was our largest referral reason, that most of our referrals came from combat deaths. And now that has been eclipsed by suicide deaths, unfortunately. So, part of that is, as the war has sort of tapered down relatively, and we've started to sort of see some different types of losses, that has shifted somewhat. So yeah, we have a whole range of services. We offer 24/7 availability of the TAPS helpline. And I'll just drop that in. It's 1-800-959-8277, 1-800-959-TAPS. And survivors of a military loss can call 24/7 and get a variety of help, from practical things like casework to peer support, peer mentoring. We have regional events. We will have our big National Military Survivor Seminar coming up over Memorial Day weekend in Washington, D.C., which pulls in well over 1,000 survivors for a weekend of healing. So that's just a snapshot, but we do so much training and consultation with private entities, with the VA, with special forces, with just different military bases when they've had a suicide loss, or they want to have some suicide prevention training or briefings.
That is, it's disheartening, but it's not surprising to hear that now most of the survivors are the family members or those that are left behind by suicide. I often say that we veterans, and I include myself in this, have lost more since we've come back from combat than we did during combat. I know that's especially true for me in individuals who I served with. And as well as I do, is that it often just doesn't happen one at a time. And this is where I guess I'd like to hear more about your work specifically in suicide prevention in TAPS, is because there's consider the suicide contagion effect, or the cluster of suicides, but it could almost be a domino effect where it's actually impacting across relationships, or even across generations.
Right. So there are definitely heightened risks for those who are impacted by suicide loss, by any type of loss really, but suicide loss is a uniquely complicated healing journey because there's often trauma and a lot of unresolved feelings and emotions come up. I remember sitting at the VA in those sessions before I came to TAPS with veteran patients who had lost a battle buddy to suicide. And those were really high stakes sessions where I really felt like they were potentially at risk. There was so much rage in the room without any clear target, sometimes directed at themselves. Why didn't I do more? Why didn't I see it? A feeling of responsibility. I think in the military there's so much training and culture that goes towards being each other's keepers, but we can't, always know what's on the inside of our brothers and sisters if they don't share and they don't say what's going on inside. So there's this sense of responsibility, even if nobody really could have known based on the information that was shared by that person who died. There's also just so much survivor guilt and fear, sort of like, what if the same thing happened to me? And what if I, became overcome with desire to end my life? So all of those feelings, again, had to really be talked about and addressed and confronted very directly. And so that kind of loops back to our earlier conversation about the importance of having a doc that you trust and that you don't need to protect, because all of that information needs to come out in a safe place with a person you trust so that it doesn't ambush you later. So let me stop there because I don't want to talk and talk.
No, I mean, that's great stuff. And you're absolutely correct. I've seen it with the veterans that I've worked with as well. You know, when they say that, you know, I'm one of the last ones of my team, or anecdotally, this is definitely not anything that I have any data to back up, but medics especially have, because some of their role or their role in combat is especially to take care of those, and they feel that burden to care for their brothers and sisters long after they're gone, and then when they're not there, you know, to quote unquote take care of them when they come back, like they were on the battlefield, they still continue. So it's almost like you know, failures of, I know I can't save anybody on the battlefield, but it's just constant failure over failure over failure. And then that idea of, well, this person was so strong and it was such a shock. They're stronger. I always saw them as stronger than me. And if they could succumb to it, then what's going to happen to me? This is really senior NCOs and officers, chaplains, mental health clinicians. These are quote unquote, if it can happen to those people, it could happen to me.
But suicide can be prevented.
Right.
When people talk about the kind of hidden pain that is eating them alive with the people that they trust, suicide can be prevented. And there's also these really hopeful movements of veterans that I've been working with. There's a group of Marines in Texas that is doing phenomenal work, keeping their tribe together, really reaching out and pulling in more members of the tribe, including their medics. And you're right. Medics see some of the worst trauma, and feel a sense of responsibility sometimes, for their brothers and sisters. That's a, unique challenge for some of them. But there's also these really like groundswells of, veterans that are coming together and changing their culture, how they talk about their hidden pain and how they address it directly and how they help each other through it. So the other side of it is that as long as people are really willing to come together and keep the tribe strong and build out their tribe, including their home front tribe, their spouses and the people that they trust from home, then suicide can absolutely be prevented.
Yeah, that's, of course, one of the things in, Dr. Joyner's interpersonal theory of suicide regarding isolation, right? You know, isolation is a big factor in a sense of burdensomeness. And so not being isolated is a protective factor against, and when I say getting closer to the edge of that cliff, that you don't even get to the edge of that cliff because you have that strong network. And you're referring, definitely, it sounds like the Marines in Texas, but many of the organizations, peer support. And peer support is also an aspect of what TAPS does. I'd like to hear your thoughts on peer support as it supports clinical mental health providers, but also how clinical mental health providers can support those who are engaging in peer support.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. So before I was at TAPS, I actually helped launch the peer support program at the VA where I worked and had a really amazing partnership with a veteran, Navy veteran, who worked very closely with me, and we developed a lot of new programs because we saw gaps that were there with how we bring veterans into care, how we engage them in care, how we continue them through the care process. So that was a really critical example for me of how it's not one or the other. I think sometimes people say, is peer support or clinical support more effective? When actually it's artfully combining both really good peer support and clinical support in many cases will really help people grow. And so TAPS has been long known to be a leader in the field in terms of best practice peer support. And we're actually doing trainings next month for the state of Montana in terms of best practice peer support. In 2017, we did a systematic review of best practice for the peer support of bereaved individuals. And we actually found that there are 8 essential qualities of effective peer support programs. So we'll be talking about those qualities of peer support programs, and even very specific things like what are the qualities of a good peer supporter? When you're hiring a support specialist, what do they need to, what kind of qualities personally do they need to come in with? What can you build in them with good training and supervision?
See, and I think that's critical. Of course, we hear a lot, just like as we were talking before about some clinicians may want to jump into working with veterans thinking they're doing a good job and not being fully aware of what the issue is. Some organizations may jump into peer support, but not really have a basic understanding of the impact of maybe some of the things they're doing on the psychological health and wellness of the veterans or the survivors that they're working with. I really appreciate how you said that it is a both, it's a both and, not either or, because there are roles as clinicians play, simply due to our role as a therapist. And then there's the role that the peer plays. And in many ways you have become, again, accepted by the tribe and a peer. I think when we first connected, I heard Mike Ergo was one of the ones that suggested that I connect with you. So Mike is a veteran like myself, and maybe we might be considered super peers, but we're clinicians, right? We have the lived experience, but we have the clinical training. But peers also need to have at least a basic understanding of mental health, so that they know that when the veteran or when the person that they're working with, when it gets out of their realm of expertise, that they turn around and have somebody that they can sort of hand them off to.
Yeah, right. It's a partnership. To me, it's building trust with veteran peers and people with lived experience and having interesting blends of lived experience and clinical support. I draw from my lived experience not as a combat veteran, but as somebody who has done a lot of interesting international travels. So it's a little bit different, but really combining forces and respecting and I think supervising and supporting peers is really critical, but also respecting them, respecting that they have a role to play and that we're stronger if we do it together. There were so many times at the VA where I would say, I'm having a little bit of trouble developing trust with this person. Can you take him on a walk and talk? And just doing that with the peer, he'd just kind of open up to the peer. And then there was something that could happen from that was really beautiful because the peer and I had such trust and respect. It's something that I talk about in some of my writing as the principle of transfer of trust, which is that you can try and develop trust one-on-one individually, starting from scratch, with every veteran that you work with. Or you can develop trust and respect with a veteran super peer or peer, and then the power that they have to say, it's all right, you can trust her. She knows her stuff, she can help, or he knows his stuff, whoever it is. They can really help you move several steps ahead instead of starting from scratch. And at TAPS, we have these amazing TAPS peer mentors who have lived experience, and that is critical to help survivors of loss, to really match them with people who have had similar types of loss and help people figure out ways to handle very practical things like, how do I talk to my child about the fact that his mother or father died by suicide? How do I say that? The peers that we have at TAPS have been there and can really help people figure out really important practical things like that, to really walking with people for as long as they need the help. So peer support is critical.
No, and you brought out a couple of points there that reminded me of some conversations that I've had before about how veterans in many ways need permission to talk about mental health from other veterans. Not permission like I will allow you to do this, but it's okay to do this. I've done this, and there's almost a need, just like you look to your squad leader when you were a young soldier, is am I on the right track? And I can see a peer coming in and really helping that veteran say, you know what, this is okay. And not only is it okay to talk about this, it's okay to talk about it with this particular individual. And so I can definitely see peers. And I'm not saying that I, as a clinician, don't need to partner with a peer. I do with various different organizations in our community, because peers really just talk on a different level. But then that idea of transfer of trust, I really like that. And this is something that I often do when I work with veterans in the community, in that, I call it offloading trust. They don't really trust the VA because they think the VA is this, huge bureaucracy. But I know a lot of the clinicians in the VA, and I trust them. And I said, you trust me, I trust them, therefore you can trust them. And again, being able to offload that trust.
Yeah, that's what I call the transfer of trust. So if the organization just looks like kind of a big dragon to somebody, but then you can say, well, actually there are really good people in that VA clinic. And that was true where I worked too. There were some really good people who were mission oriented that came to work at the VA because they wanted to serve. And they were good. And so being able to, transfer that trust from provider to provider, from peer to provider, it can make a critical difference for someone who's difficult to engage in care.
Yeah, and that's great. And I think that, and I agree. I consider peer support very significant. I've had, a buddy of mine, Bennett Tanton, who is a peer support specialist on the show before. But maybe here's an idea, and this is one of the things that perhaps many people have been frustrated with peer support is there's really no one standard peer support training, especially when it comes to veteran mental health. Not that we really need a national standard, but this is, again, just speculation on my part, but why couldn't we create mental health peers the same way that we, provide training for EMTs, right? I can go to a local community college and go through, a semester or 2 semesters of college and come out with basic EMT certifications. Why wouldn't we do that? Because that's what I see. Peers are essentially sort of the first responders, the EMTs that are usually right there on the line. And what the EMT does is very different than what the emergency room doctor does.
Right. I mean, that is definitely a vision that I share with you, Dwayne. And in fact, doing the training for the Montana VA and Montana Mayor's Challenge, we are going to focus on best practice peer support. How do you build a best practice peer support program? How do you find the right peers? How do you support them? And what kind of qualities must the program have? And so I'm hoping that grows legs, because I think that, based on, we did a systematic review of best practice last year, 2017. Excuse me, it wasn't quite last year, but very recently at TAPS. And TAPS has really figured out the peer thing for well over, 2 decades. In the suicide prevention and postvention team, we've supported over our long, period at TAPS, we've supported over 11,000 survivors of suicide loss. And so over all of that time, just refining what needs to happen for this peer support to be effective. How do we best support those who are impacted by suicide with the peer support that we offer? Has really given us some unique levels of insight. So I totally share your vision.
Yeah, maybe if we can get some more people on board, we can take it nationwide. But this is, this really has to be able to be seen by the benefit to individuals. And this is where I or those of us who believe in peer support have to turn around to our colleagues and say, look, it's not all therapy in the room, as you just said, or as you said earlier. Talking about, going on a deployment with Team Rubicon, right? Getting out of the therapy office, and getting some lived experience around the veterans that you work with. Because if you only see them, in the therapy hour and that's all you know about them, then you're not going to be as effective with this particular population. Maybe not with any population, but in my experience, especially with veterans.
It's really critical. And I think it takes a certain level of humility to be able to say, I'm going to put the veterans' needs first, and maybe it's not me on this particular aspect of where they may need to grow. So, for example, I have ways of talking with veterans that generally went really, really well in terms of firearm safety conversations. But there were some veterans that I was seeing where I thought, you know what, it would be better if I asked the peer that I have this trust and respect with to take this conversation to the next level, because he can pull them aside and say, I own firearms, so there's no, sort of looking at you with any motivation, even perceived, if inaccurate, to remove any firearms from you. It's just not about that. It's about, safety and how are you storing them, and when you're having thoughts of taking yourself out, what are you doing about that to keep others safe? If you're really dedicated to protecting other people from the massive collateral damage of losing you, then what are you doing to keep your loved ones safe? And he can have that conversation in ways that are just different than I was able to have with some patients. And so I think it just goes back to that partnership and really being humble enough to say, what's best for this person right now, and going with that plan.
No, I absolutely recognize that, and clinicians who may be listening know this, that if we're working with a particular client and we're just not, connecting, then it's up to us to help find the right clinician for that client, and a veteran in this case. I've had the same situation in which, the whole senior NCO as a therapist thing didn't actually work for them because some of their problems in the military were around how they were treated by senior NCOs, and so just recognizing that, this isn't, I personally am not the right fit, knowing that I'm not going to be the guy or you're not going to be the gal that is able to touch every veteran. And we need to make sure that we put the needs of the veteran. And I think this goes to all of the organizations. Many people in the veteran space, I say, are in love with their own solution, and they think that the veteran needs their solution. That we need to understand the service member, the veteran, the family member, what their needs are before our own particular needs.
Yeah, right. And, sometimes it's about co-treating. A lot of times I co-treated my veteran patients with the peer that I was working with, and that changed the dynamics, because I think, in the military, sometimes there's sort of more of a team environment, like we're going to do this as a team. So just adding one person takes it out of that medical model, one-on-one patient and therapist kind of model. I was able to kind of restructure things a little bit to say, the peer and I are going to work with you. And so different pieces of the work, he might take the lead on, or I might take the lead on other pieces of the work. But we kind of all put our heads together, and it changed the dynamic to us three working as a team in terms of what the veteran wanted to achieve for him or herself. And that felt like a good and important shift as well with my patients. What do you think?
No, I absolutely agree. As I'm hearing you did not take a position of expertise that I am the doctor, literally, or I am the professional and you're not. I have, again, this anecdotal idea that I've seen it a lot when veterans will go into, say, a med management provider, and they'll just do whatever the med management provider says because they're the guy or gal with the piece of paper on the wall. When I was in the military, I was listening to the guy or the gal with a piece of paper on the wall, right? So you're the expert. I'm not. I listen to you. And you took that sort of hierarchical relationship and you said, we're all on the same level. I'm bringing you up to my level because this is about as much you, the veteran, and I'm going to bring in my team. And that's the teamwork aspect, as you said, is another thing that veterans are familiar with. And the more we can get veterans familiar with and understanding about mental health, the more likely they are to access it and then benefit from it.
Right. I think there's so much about transition that is about helping veterans make the shift away from that I outrank you or you outrank me kind of mentality to something where we're actually working together on something. So I think there's a real cost when a provider, and I've written about this quite a bit, when a provider really says, I'm the doctor and you're the patient, particularly with veterans. I think we have a responsibility to help kind of recalibrate the individual's sense of rights and their freedoms, to really make decisions about what the best way forward is and create a relationship that's fundamentally collaborative and mutually respectful. So yeah, I'm not big on coming in as a doctor, but more really trying to show veterans that they can trust me as a doc. Those two things are not the same to me. And so I've really kind of worked on how I can shift my practice and my stance with my patients so that I'm not so much a doctor, but a doc.
And it goes back to the idea of medics, right? All medics, and I've never known a medic with an MD or a DO or a PhD, but all the medics are called docs, right? And you trust a doc. At one point I cranked my ankle in Iraq, and I trusted my doc a little too much because he didn't tell me to go get it checked out when I should have. But yes, there is that idea of, well, I trust doc, and there is that, that level of, again, almost acceptance and brought into the tribe.
Yeah, that's why the name means so much to me when veterans kind of, sort of refer to me as Doc Springer. It means something to me. It talks about, the trust that we develop with each other, the mutual respect that we have, the collaboration, and the way we're both going to pull in the same direction, not with one person outranking the other for any reason. So yeah, it's really critical to how I see working with veterans.
Oh, that's really great. And before we started talking, you had mentioned that along with your work with TAPS, you've got some other things coming down the pipe.
Yeah, one of my 3 a.m. labors of love that I started before I started at TAPS was working on a book about the hidden pain that I think really eats people alive until they really, and not to say here that suicide risk can be reduced to one thing. If anything, I know more than maybe most people that suicide is the result of a perfect storm of stress. It's never just one factor, one cause. No one person creates suicide risk. But really thinking about all of the hidden pain that I saw as a doc with my veterans, and thinking about that process of moving away from that clinical role and how I can help other people that are coming into the VA, that are coming into community agencies, private organizations that are trying to build that kind of trust that I've been able to build with veterans. How do we build that trust? How do we reduce stigma? How do we help them talk about their hidden pain? How do we help them move through really challenging things like grief and loss? How do we help them discover a meaningful life after the transition out of the military? So that's hopefully going to come out sometime this year. It's been a long labor of love, late nights, and hard to predict when things will come out, but I'm hoping to bring that forward sometime in 2019.
And that's great. And I have this idea. It's, we're not esoteric keepers of knowledge, right? This is one of the, especially in maybe an academic community, the one with the long list of things that they know that other people don't, kind of gives them a hierarchy. But as you had mentioned, the suicide rate across the nation, and especially in the populations that we serve, it's too great to keep this knowledge to ourselves. Give it away and give it away freely. This is my, the whole drive behind the blog and the podcast for me is to help others not know what I know. I'm not saying that I'm the expert, but at least to be able to say, this is what has been seen to work, and this is how we can reach the individuals. And that sounds a lot like, as you said, how TAPS is going to Montana to share what they've learned. But then you're able to take what you've learned and how you've developed an entrance into the tribe and how you've gotten accepted, and share that knowledge with other clinicians so that they can be more effective in working with veterans.
Well, and thank you for what you said, because it's so true. This is not a book just for people who want to work with veterans. This is a book about the war on hopelessness that we're fighting as a society. It's a book that I hope will really help people across society, because the really interesting thing that I learned in working with veterans is the thought that these are some of the strongest people in our society. who have faced some of the most difficult challenges that humans face, and they struggle with hopelessness at times. And so really, I think what I learned from that work really helped me understand the shape of what true character is, what courage is, and a lot of insights about the bonds of love that keep people in the fight, whether they're veterans or first responders or people in society that are protectors, mothers, fathers, people that would lay their lives down for other people. People you wouldn't predict might struggle with hidden pain. So many people are struggling with hidden pain that the book is really designed to reach those people with insights that I learned from working with veterans, but I hope for the benefit of many, many more people.
No, that's great. I often explain to veterans that I work with that, and again, not like you, not trying to reduce it down to one single thing, but suicide is an attempt to end pain. It's suffering, really, but pain unending is suffering, whether that be physical pain, spiritual pain, moral pain, psychological pain, but really it's an attempt to stop pain. And in your case, what you're talking about, if that pain is hidden, those people who may be able to help relieve that pain don't know that there's something there to relieve.
I had a conversation just last week with a Marine who talked about meeting up with a former battle buddy, and actually somebody who outranked him, and that person brought up the topic of fear when you're in a combat zone. That sometimes we don't even admit to feeling intense fear when you're about to, go into combat and things are about to go kinetic. And so just talking about the fear that they experienced helped both of them just dissolve that fear, the shame around the fear that's generated when those things stay hidden. So there is a real, just profound power in flushing these things out with people that are safe to hear them and that don't think any differently of you, that you can just reckon with them and confront them head on to really move through them. So that's what, my work is fundamentally about. I'm so honored to work with TAPS. We're doing so much work across the country with really looking at changing culture and changing messaging and supporting those who have been impacted by suicide loss. So I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Yeah, no, and I'm grateful that you came on the show to talk about it. If people wanted to reach out and learn more about you, about TAPS, about how they can get involved, because TAPS is in every state, every city, every state in the nation and internationally, how can they find out more about that?
Yeah, so the best place would probably be online at www.taps.org/suicide. taps.org/suicide. Taps.org is also our general web landing page with all of the services for all kinds of loss. And then the suicide specific subpage is my team and all of the training and consultation and the National Military Suicide Survivor Seminar that we will be hosting in Phoenix in October. So that would be a good place to start. And I've got my bio and everything online as well there.
That's great. And I'll make sure to have those links in the show notes. And absolutely, as I mentioned before, we started talking and even right now is when the book comes out, feel free to come back on. I'd love to be able to talk about it and hear, how it's gone as far as, how it's finally developed in the launch and everything else.
Thanks, Dwayne. It's really been a pleasure today. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, where we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. I always enjoy having mental health professionals who are not veterans come on the show. I often hear from veterans that they won't talk to a mental health professional who isn't a combat veteran, and if that's true for them, that's okay, but it's not necessarily true. Clinicians like Doc Springer prove that you don't have to be a veteran to help veterans. It doesn't mean that you don't have to prepare either, though. Helping a veteran through their mental health concerns is not like helping a veteran with physical health issues. As she said in our conversation, anyone who wants to work with veterans needs to put the work in to understand the unique experiences that veterans have. I would also like to share some information about suicide prevention and postvention. The Psych Armor Institute has launched online courses in suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. Doc Springer recorded the first 2 videos of a 15-video series, Barriers to Treatment and Postvention Healing After Suicide. She discusses barriers to veterans' mental health treatment as well as actions following suicide that can help promote healing. The courses are part of Psych Armor Institute's new portfolio on suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention, sponsored by the NFL Foundation. If you recall, we had Marjorie Morrison, the founder of Psych Armor, on the podcast back in episode 52, and their catalog of videos is a great place to start for anyone who's interested in learning more about how to address the epidemic of veteran suicide. If you want to check out these videos, the links will be in the show notes. Thanks for taking the time to check us out. If you want to find the show notes for this episode, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST116. We're always looking for guests. You can drop me a line at info@veteranmentalhealth.com to recommend guests, or you go to veteranmentalhealth.com/guest to fill out a suggestion or request. Our thanks this month go to Given Hour and the Campaign to Change Direction. Don't forget, we'll be joining them for the Week to Change Direction from June 9th through the 15th. If you want to see how you can too, go to changedirection.org.
A Week to Change Direction will happen anywhere and everywhere people and organizations want to be part of this change. Given Hour will provide toolkits with suggestions and ideas for how you or your organization can participate in a Week to Change Direction, or you can create your own.
Just a reminder that the guests and information in this show are for educational purposes only and not meant to be considered professional advice. While Doc Springer and I are practicing therapists, we're not your therapist. If something you heard makes you think that you should talk to somebody, then reach out to do so. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use his track Not Alone from his album Combat Medicine. Doc's trying to bring the discussion about veteran mental health out of the darkness, and you can see all of his work at therealdoctodd.com. Make sure to join us next week for another great episode. Hit subscribe on your podcast player of choice so you don't miss it. And until then, remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a piece and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
That every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.
I try so